Good afternoon, everybody. We appreciate everybody coming down this afternoon to talk to us about the 2015 Salina Live Housing Assessment and Strategic Plan. Marty Schukert from RDG Planning and Design from Omaha, Nebraska is here to talk to you about some of the things that went on with the housing study, how they went through the process and that type of thing. We'll give you a brief overview, and then he's going to open it up to questions. One of the things we did earlier on, Marty was here and he talked to the city commissioners, and they requested that some questions be sent to me and then forwarded on to Marty. That did not happen. We had 0 questions come in, so this is going to be a pretty well open segment this afternoon where Marty will do a brief overview of the program and of the study, and then he'll get into some question and answers that you may have of him and how they went through the process as well. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce to you Marty Schukert. He is a planner with the RDG Planning and Design out of Omaha, Nebraska. So, Marty, it's up to you.
I will turn my thing on here so I don't have to stand in one place. Well, first of all, it's good to be here this afternoon with you. It's nice to see all the leaves green. You're a bit ahead of us as far as I think probably both daylight and temperature go. So it's nice to see that spring has sprung along with daylight savings time, causing us to spring ahead on our time, which got me running a little bit late this morning. Honestly, that I haven't totally adjusted. But I want to just spend a couple of minutes, and literally a couple of minutes, talking about the document itself, and really some of the questions or thoughts that it was meant to answer, and then get into questions and answers and discussion, because we really, I think, saw this workshop more as a continuation of the commission meeting maybe a month or a month and a half ago, where there was a good deal of discussion and deliberation, and there are other things on the agenda. So this is really, in a way, a carryover of that meeting. So those of you who wanted to see a 54-slide PowerPoint, it's here, but I'm probably going to disappoint you unless, by popular demand, you would really like to see it. First of all, the document does a couple of things. The first half of it is really intended to look at housing demand and to quantify the number of units and the prices of units and so forth that are needed in Salina. And again, I won't go over those numbers in detail. We have it with us, except to point out that, first of all, Salina is a city that is continuing to grow, not at a rapid rate, but at a moderate rate, that it is generating a continued demand for housing, and that housing falls across a variety of price ranges. There is a specific focus in Salina, as there are in most communities, on what we call workforce housing. Generally, the private market is pretty successful at building housing in upper ranges, whatever that demand turns out to be, but it's a little bit less successful at the more marginal reaches. And so we quantify the number of units that we're projecting based on certain growth demands for new housing development. And those numbers are included in the document. But probably most interesting and important to you from a policy perspective deals with the second half of the document, and that is what we refer to as a policy framework. There are a number of different issues that we needed to deal with and that were within our scope to address in the housing in this document. One of which dealt with the challenges that Salina and really again cities like Salina face in delivering housing. Secondly, given that analysis, the right policy to take in terms of public participation in development financing. And I suspect that that will be a significant amount of our discussion today. You have been in a discussion or really debate over the last year on what, if any, risk or participation should the public sector take through devices such as special assessments to help develop the infrastructure, the public improvements that are necessary to provide the improved lots that you can then build housing on. And there's been a lively debate on that, and a debate that we entered into in the document. In looking at that issue, there are, again, a number of parameters or issues that need to be considered. One is what motivates housing development and what kinds of things go into the heads of people who are either developing housing or building, developing housing, building housing, or buying housing that relate to the security of that investment or the amount of risk that people are willing to undertake. When builders are building housing, they have a reasonable expectation of profit and tend to be risk averse. When they're buying housing, they have sort of the same expectation. People who live outside of San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York don't necessarily expect a huge investment return on housing, but they don't want to lose money either. So there's a real sense of investing or buying a house in places that at least have surrounding values that are sufficient to sustain that value and minimize that risk. So the document goes into an analysis of some of the psychology of both housing purchases and housing development. Obviously, renters are a little bit less risk aversive because, as my wife always says, you're not buying it. But nevertheless, that's usually in reference to a hotel room that we're somewhat disappointed about. But that type of calculation goes into those those decisions. When we think about public improvement financing, there really are two issues that are in play when you're looking at things from a public sector point of view. Number one is what kinds of incentives does one think we need to provide in order to get a desired result or avoid an undesirable result? And two, from an economic point of view, how do we understand the constraints and needs of the people who are going to deliver housing and respond to those kinds of things? So an example of the first of providing incentives is that one of the last things we would like is for people to go out in the middle of the country, build high-cost housing 2 miles out of the city, draining the tax base of the city out in that direction because there isn't sufficient incentive to build adjacent to the city with urban improvements. That's a case of, if we want that kind of development adjacent to the city and annexable to the city from an economic point of view, there should be an incentive of some sort to provide that. On the other hand, there are economic imperatives, and that is that, from an investment point of view, again, developing subdivisions and subdivision lots is not necessarily a great investment from a developer's point of view, particularly in a market that tends to be pretty slow on absorption. So by understanding the risk, we also understand the economics and constraints that builders and developers work under. So the incentive structure is then based on that understanding, we hope, of things that we have learned over 3 or 4 decades of doing this about markets, and of surgically and strategically forming the financing structure in such a way that it doesn't subsidize too much or put the city in a risky situation that it ought not be in, but to provide and encourage the kinds of outcomes that we want to see happen. That deals with what's going on in the private market, what I think of as being the unassisted market, but the general construction of private homes. The other issue that's a very significant one deals with the idea of redevelopment and of infill development in existing parts of the city. We have a significant issue in a lot of parts of Salina, and that is surrounding in the areas that we would like to see developed, ambient or typical housing values in the surrounding neighborhoods that are below the cost of building new housing. It's tough to build a $170,000, $200,000, $250,000 house in neighborhoods where housing values are $80,000 or $90,000 or $100,000. So that's a significant issue because that relates to the risk that's undertaken both by home buyers and home builders. So the plan identifies really more of a philosophy and illustrates it with some specific sites. The philosophy in terms of redevelopment is to find a place where you can do something that will work, that does not involve excessive risk, that we've called a beachhead, and that can take a small area and really transform that area. The criteria for that beachhead should be a high degree of visibility, a sense that this area is somewhere on the community agenda, that's not just kind of hidden off somewhere, but so that people can see it and relate to it, and it can build off of other significant strengths. And then from that beachhead, as in a military action, you then build from there. So the beachhead gets a little bit bigger with adjacent development, a little bit bigger as we get a little bit more ambitious in terms of building a significant new project, and then expanding to the degree that ultimately at the end of the process, the strategic process, there's a self-sustaining market in the area, and any further subsidization or assistance or public action is no longer necessary. You will see in the document, and you have seen in the document, a couple of illustrations of how this process can work that are geographically based, but they're not necessarily the only ones where that can happen. So they're meant to be illustrations of a philosophy. But the one thing that we think is very important is the idea of an incremental, gradual, strategic process, particularly in redevelopment neighborhoods, of moving forward from something that's relatively doable and small, but illustrates the success of that type of an approach that then grows to something bigger, that then grows to something bigger, that grows to something bigger, and ultimately increases the values of an entire neighborhood so that people can get the appraisals that they need and can realize the resale value and the housing economics that ultimately create a self-sustaining market. The document concludes with what we called a bridge ahead, that is sort of I guess a valedictory statement to say, here's whatever you do, here are the processes that we have to go through, and that bridge ahead process involves, first of all, solving the issue of public financing, getting that off the table and getting that process moving. We hope in the way that we suggested, we hope that provides a contribution. Number two, to execute a neighborhood-based demonstration that identifies the efficacy of the market that we think is probably the most important that is not being met now, and that's affordable equity or owner-occupied housing. And we showed a not uncontroversial site, the Centennial Park site, to demonstrate that it's possible to have it both ways. That is, to have a better neighborhood park and a demonstration of an owner-occupied project, and do it both ways in a ways that really enhance everybody's property value and will demonstrate that this is an approach that can succeed in other parts of the city. That 3 establishes a focus on North Salina and establishes a development partnership, including a development corporation or other semi-public or nonprofit body that can begin that process of moving forward with the development of a beachhead and ultimately larger scale development throughout North Salina, with the ultimate goal that North Salina becomes an equivalent growth center to south and eastern parts of the city. Number 4, to establish a line item budget in the city's annual budget that deals with neighborhood development. And that neighborhood development involves things like infrastructure, such as neighborhood street rehabilitation and reconstruction, sidewalks, which can be very, very effective in terms, street reconstruction and sidewalks can be very effective in terms of encouraging people on a street to begin to reinvest in their property without any further inducement, property acquisition, other assistance to redevelopment projects, and then finally make sure, and we think this is an important one, that housing is a significant and ongoing part of your extremely encouraging and ambitious downtown development plans. This is especially true because North Salina and downtown are so tightly together, so tightly wound, so tightly bound together, so that the success of one will help to feed the success of the other. So with that overview, I'd be glad to hopefully just talk, but I came today sort of fearing a more congressional hearing, or well, either that or a candidate's town hall, one of the two, but of which I seem to have been seeing about 1 million of them every day. But I welcome a good discussion on the plan and on moving forward.
Thank you, Marty. Since this is a commission study session, let's just kind of try and figure out where we're going, what we want. So end of the day, is there anything in particular staff would like to have us at least thinking about at the end of the day?
Yeah, I would say, again, the question being, what would staff like to have at the end of the day for those at home? It would be nice to know if you're comfortable with the plan as is, that we could bring it back and have it approved, or if there are suggested modifications, changes to the plan that you agree to, what those are, so that they could make those, and then we can bring it back and get it approved.
Okay, with the idea on that being, say the plan is approved and you're looking for, and we'll just go with approve the plan as is. What would that mean?
Okay, it's a good question. I think what approval would mean is probably a resolution that would accept the plan, in essence, and would probably state that it is a guidance document that would be used when we look at all housing decisions, that's consciously looked at, so it's not forgotten and put on a shelf. Certainly, it's not a binding document in the sense that if the governing body looks at a section of it that may be applicable to a decision, you'd consciously talk about that in incorporation of the plan. If you should choose to do something different, you can always do that. You wouldn't bind yourself to the detail of that type of document, but you do want to actively utilize that with the decision making.
Okay, so as a policy tool, it would be probably to things that we have in place at the time. Would you say it's probably the closest thing is when the commission adopted the river renewal master plan as part of the comprehensive plan as a policy document? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I don't know if you would adopt this as part of your comprehensive plan, or if you would use pieces of it to create policies that deal with housing and development separate from the plan. To me, and I would see what Marty's thoughts are as well, but I look at it as a broader guidance document, and you could pull pieces and later say, okay, if we use this direction of the document, let's create a policy that deals with housing or development in this way, and it's a separate policy rather than to take a document like this, which is pretty detailed, and bring it in as a part of your comprehensive plan. Because once you adopt something as part of your comprehensive plan, there's a little bit more of an enforcement sort of aspect to it. So I'd say
yeah,
what
I
Marty's thoughts are.
totally agree with that. I know there had been some conversation about this being adopted as a comprehensive plan section, and it really wasn't written that way. That, for example, somebody if adopted as a comprehensive plan, somebody could specifically say that, that if you had a project in the northwestern part of the city that didn't specifically agree with the illustration in this document, that would violate the comprehensive plan. That's absolutely not the that was absolutely not the intention of something that's just illustrating an idea. So it's really the policies that matter, and it is written as an analytical document from a demand point of view and a policy document, but really not as a comprehensive plan section. So we would absolutely, I'm glad you volunteered that, because I was debating whether to, that it should not be adopted as a comp plan. It might be possible to take some pages out of it and that are good guidance and make those part of the comprehensive plan, but the whole thing should not be part of the comprehensive plan.
And one of the things that I saw and I felt was particularly useful is it on? One of the things that I found particularly useful and informative about the study is that it really helps us to identify and move along areas in the implementation matrix of the comp plan. So as far as some of the things that we have to do to actually implement the plan, it actually provides a lot of the
That's right.
tools and framework
Exactly.
for allowing us to move forward in that fashion.
Exactly.
So I find that helpful. What we'll do then is, I think we'll be able to get that to you today, is that normally on a city commission study session we take, it's only about an hour and 45 minutes, so we generally take about 45 minutes or so and provide questions, because part of that time is taken up with the presentation, which thank you for the brief summary there. So what we'll do now is, and I must say I apologize for not sending questions to you, because when I heard that you were graciously agreed to being here in person, I thought, well, we'll have the time to ask you, and we don't need to send you the questions. But anyway.
You assume I need no time for preparation. That was the problem.
You're a pro. I don't think you do. I mean, based on your presentation in November, I thought you handled that very well. So, and this will not be a congressional hearing. So.
That's good.
Anyway, so what we'll do at this time
I
is,
had nothing to do with the Benghazi. No emails, right.
So I don't know if any other, I see Commissioner Crawford has notes there. And so if you'd like to. Okay, I was going to offer to let you go first. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and ask a series of questions, and just we kind of generally end up doing a roundtable with the commission, and sometimes questions will come up in the course of conversation. I think that we will have adequate time following that if at that time planning commissioners, and thank you all for being here, if you have questions as well, we'd kind of turn it over to you after that, and then following that we should still have adequate time for conversations from the public, which will probably help benefit from having us ask some of the questions and vet out some of the concerns, and have the public weigh in, ask questions, and add as well. So having said that, I'll go ahead and start, since I have a big page.
Sounds good.
And I'll just start with, I think that we're all pleased that we're able to have this housing needs assessment taken care of. And I'll just kind of go back to, I can't remember, it was sometime in 2014, maybe at the end, or 2015, sometime when we went through the process and everything. And one of the things that I really thought we'd get out of this, and I think we did, is before we hired you, I went and looked at a number of the plans that you and your group had done: North Omaha, Norfolk, Nebraska, Hayes, Kansas locally, Excelsior Springs, and some of those. And one of the things, and this is going to lead to a question, maybe you can do it and it'll help to maybe spur other questions. In those communities, you emphasize, and many of them, I think there were comprehensive plans, and they were housing.
They were, right, with
they were
housing
housing
elements.
studies, parts of that. Is that there is a pretty strong emphasis on not necessarily infill, but infill and smart growth as an overall strategy, which looked at balancing and municipal budgets and everything else like that. And at least in the case of Hayes and Excelsior Springs, there were annexation policies as well. Couple questions, and maybe you can give us just some insights. One of the things that we struggle with is getting a definition of infill that everybody can agree with. Can you give us a definition of infill that maybe incorporates into the larger smart growth, the advantages of smart growth,
Yeah.
and then also just with those communities and several others, 60 or more, whatever it was, that you have done, and what those communities, what their appetite was for those types of plans, and how they're doing.
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, to try to give you an operating definition of infill. Infill generally means new construction or new development on areas that are within the built-up city that are either vacant or underutilized or are in an inappropriate use. For example, areas that once had industrial land uses that don't have a market and now they're just kind of sitting there. But the operative word is that infill generally means identifying opportunities. They might be small and they might be large, but within the area that we consider to be the urbanized city of Salina or any other city. So that, that's kind of a loosely operating definition. There are areas, for example, that are open land, both northeast and northwest of the developed part of the city, that are technically kind of incremental extensions, but because they're adjacent to older areas, we'd probably still tend to consider those infill. So the second, and obviously infill is a highly desirable thing to do from a number of perspectives. One is that it uses existing infrastructure efficiently. In a lot of areas, we have infrastructure, sewers, water lines, and so forth that are in the ground that are maintained, that are not being used effectively or not being used to maximum use. Oddly enough, infrastructure is weird because it deteriorates from disuse more than it deteriorates from use. So a sewer or water line that has no flow going through it tends to deteriorate, and so we have a double-edged problem there. The next type of growth is what I would refer to as contiguous or adjacent development, and that is development that is new and might be considered greenfield development. That is, there was nothing there before, but that's adjacent to the boundary of the existing city. That is the existing city that's served by urban services. So contiguous development is desirable because you can do incremental extensions of sewers and water lines and so forth that are already there and hopefully are sized to be able to accomplish, to be able to serve new development. And so the result is growth that doesn't stick a lot of extra infrastructure into the ground. Then the third level of development that is really the one thing that we, in a policy like this, try to avoid as much as we can is non-contiguous development, sometimes called leapfrog, where people will go out beyond the limit of development, and I don't necessarily mean a few hundred feet, but a mile or a mile and a half, and do a development that either requires very extensive extensions of utilities to serve it, or no utilities at all. And that's actually, in some ways, the worst problem. The issue is that it is a lot cheaper for a developer to do a subdivision that isn't governed by city regulations, by sewer connections and so forth, out in the country somewhere, to put in individual systems like septics, and to build those things in places that the city really can never annex them because they're just too far away, and the cost of going back and providing urban services is simply too expensive. But there's a built-in incentive to do that because on a per lot basis, the cost of those kinds of improvements, sometimes they might be unpaved roads or septic systems and so forth, can be a lot cheaper than building urban subdivisions adjacent to the city. So if I'm a developer and I've got a beautiful site 2 miles away and I'm trying to sell $500,000 houses, it might be more advantageous to me to go out in the country somewhere, but not more advantageous to the city of Salina or any other city. So we could think about residential development in that kind of sort of trifurcated construct. And I guess there's another one even on the other side of infill that applies to many cities, and Salina is one of those, and that's redevelopment, where you take an area that's blighted or completely obsolete, and you knock it down and start and rebuild it and start over. So each one of those things has its own financing issues, its own degree of difficulty, and its own policy. And one of the things we try to do in the plan is to sort of take those apart and say, in redevelopment, these are the things that we should be looking at. In infill, these things. In contiguous development, these things, all to try to make sure that as much development as possible falls within the economic jurisdiction of Salina, because Salina is our client, and that's who we want, and it's the welfare of Salina that we're really primarily interested in.
How would you define, you say, and you've had in the study, obsolete housing? What would be contributing factors to the obsolescence?
Well, first of all, structural deterioration to the point that the houses just don't, that feasibility of rehabilitation just isn't there. So you get a house that whose structure is deteriorating, that might have lead paint issues, which is another serious can of worms, obviously, and with the Flint infrastructure situation, we're getting much more sensitized, even more to lead hazards, which are really terrible. So there are those issues that might have systems that are so expensive to replace that they just don't make sense economically. So from a structural point of view, you have a house that is badly deteriorated to the degree that it requires $80,000 worth of work, which might be 4 times its market value. That is obsolete housing from a structural or structure point of view. A second concept of obsolete housing, I suppose, are houses that just don't, under any circumstances, meet market demands. Although even that's changing a little bit. So we have houses that are very small in parts of the city that are a few hundred square feet. And one could look at that and say, well, no one will ever live in any of those, so they're really obsolete. They don't meet the needs of a family market. But oddly enough, mini housing is becoming quite the thing among millennials. So even a little tiny house sometimes has some economic value to it. And then the third are just issues of market preferences. There might be aspects of the floor plan that are just not acceptable and that need either major reconstruction or replacement. When I was growing up as a baby boomer and in the 1950s, and there were a tremendous amount of homes being built, you would get rooms that were like 6 by 8 or 8 by 10 foot bedrooms that you'd stick your 2 kids in, and that just doesn't quite sell anymore. So So obsolescence really falls in a number of different areas. The most significant of which is structural obsolescence.
What would you, staying on the subject of the
Mhm.
obsolescence, and speaking of some areas of North Salina where you've had tear downs and demolitions and in a block where you might normally have 22 lots, you now have 3. What, I mean, if you wouldn't call that obsolescence on a larger scale,
It
what
is.
would you call that?
Yeah, well, and that's an interesting question, because there are several sites in North Salina where there are a lot of vacant lots or underutilized lots. They may be owned by somebody, and probably are owned by somebody, that are relatively adjacent to each other, but they're interrupted by a few scattered houses from place to place. And if you remove those houses, you could put together a larger assemblage of property. Those are, from my point of view, are things that you really would like to look at, and you would say that even from a site perspective, that is one house surrounded by 5 vacant lots, the house might not be obsolete, but you could do something. If it's not a good structure, you could do something with that larger area that you couldn't do with the lots that are scattered. So those are areas where you try to think about acquisition. You try to negotiate a purchase with a homeowner, a property owner, and be able to put those kinds of assemblages together. You know, one of the big difficulties with doing that, with quote redevelopment, is acquisition. It's just buying a property that you don't own. There tends to be little appetite for the use of eminent domain, particularly when we're talking about owner-occupied housing. I have been intrigued, by the way, in terms of some of the candidates' debates about eminent domain entering into the discussion, and having a candidate be a real estate developer who's starting to give lectures on the positive uses of eminent domain to people who don't necessarily agree with him. Trump has certainly used it or had government agencies use it, but all those things enter in, and it's a good opportunity to mention that for infill to work effectively, there's got to be critical mass. You know, you can't just do one house here and one house there and one house there. Whether we're talking about a city the size of Salina or the city the size of Omaha or the city the size of Cleveland, you can't make that work because people don't have the security of the critical mass of a series of homes that are kind of similar in value. So I tend to think and advise that infill that's like a lot here and a lot there and a lot there and a lot there is not a policy that's going to succeed. There's got to be a certain amount of critical mass, of volume, to begin to change the character of the adjacent area.
I was looking on page 37 of the study, and this is the draft study, by the way.
Yeah.
That I'm looking at, and it shows
So am I looking at it.
population
Right here.
projections.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because I'm on another commission, I was provided, just coincidentally, with some population projections from the University of Kansas, the Institute for Policy and Social Research, which estimated in 40 years that Saline County's population would be 56,000. And I was just curious, and that would mean that virtually no population
growth at all, yeah.
And I was thinking, just in terms, and I don't know about how scientific the study was, but I'm assuming they know what they're doing. Assume that we have no population growth. And the study that you show, you're projecting the need for 116 houses when we've been seeing need for 65. How would that change the outcomes and the projections and all of that of your study for our situation?
First of all, the issue of population projections is a really funny issue. Generally, and let me start by talking a little bit about methodology and just how, because there are different ways of looking at it. I suspect that a study like the one that shows no growth uses a couple of different ideas or different. We all do cohort survival. That is, you look at the population in a given period, age that population over decades, and you provide a certain kind of that you define a population target that's going to grow by natural population change. So, for example, if you have 5,000 people who are ages 25 to 35 in 2010, we'll use the census years, 5,000 people from 25 to 35, 4,900 of those will live to be counted as being 35 to 45 in 2020. And so the cohort survival idea begins with aging those population cohorts or groups over time. Secondly, you look at birth rates, and so that's going to assign a certain birth rate, and assigning that birth rate depends on predicting the future and predicting how many kids people are going to have in the future and when they're going to get married, because all those factors are changing as well. And you look at fertility among those age groups. Thirdly, you look at migration, and migration is a significant one that involves how people are moving around and whether more people are moving into an area or out of an area. So you could take an optimistic view and say we're going to generate so many new jobs and that's going to produce positive in-migration, or you could take a pessimistic view or a view that might have a grounding in the last 20 years of history and say that our employment is going to be stagnant, and so we're really just kind of churning the population around. There's also internal migration, and that is people moving from county to city, which is another issue. So I would say that population projection feels a little on the conservative side, on the pessimistic side, and that's probably a good thing. Now, the direction that we took was to look at all of those things, but to say that there should be some moderate aspirational quality to what we plan for in the community. So that is that rather than say we're going to plan for, we're just going to kind of sit here and not have any growth at all. So we're just going to deal with replacement needs and the housing needs that are created by people who are already here who might be entering the housing market produces a certain steady state. But we might say that if we do things to reinvest in Salina, to make the area more attractive, to generate new jobs, to attract some new industries over the area, or to do some of the other things that you're doing from an investment point of view that make the city better qualitatively, then that investment's going to pay off by increasing migration. And that's kind of what we've done here. We've said, well, you know, we're in a city where we want to plan for something that's a little bit more than we're getting now. That's a little bit more than just population stagnation. So what is a reasonable payoff in terms of a growth dividend from the investments that are being made in the community? And that's really what this is based on. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, but let's say, what happens if all of those projections don't happen?
You don't build that much housing.
Right, but I'm just saying, I understand that part of
Yeah.
it. But would that change any of the basic precepts of what we're talking about here?
I think that it changes the housing production, but the market is not going to go out and build 110 housing units per year if there's no market for them.
It may dictate more replacement housing versus.
Yeah. I mean, so when we put a number out there, we're not expecting that response to happen immediately. You know, you don't. There are places that, I mean, we tend to be a little bit on the conservative side too, but generally a lot of the it's very much a chicken and egg thing. You know, a lot of the more we have seen population projections that have been very blue sky that say, well, you know, Salina at 50,000 now is going to have by 2050 is going to have 70,000 people. There's no justification for that. And there are others that just kind of look at the existing trends of the last decade or two and say that's just, the future is just going to continue. And we're sort of, if not taking a middle ground, showing something that we think is a little bit more optimistic than that. And that in turn becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
There's just so many things that are beyond our control. Like,
Totally, yeah.
you know, like at one point we were a big wheat center, and that's no longer the case. And in the future, water may become a bigger issue than we know, and that it's hard to figure that out.
Yeah, well, that's right. And what the actual growth in a community is very related to industrial decisions or employer decisions that are difficult to predict now. So the policy issues in the plan are really things that we think are constants regardless of what the population turns out to be. It'll be the production side that matters, unless you're going to make a decision to go out and build a lot of infrastructure based on building 100 or 200 housing units a year, which we would absolutely not recommend. That's why smart growth, which I consider to be a combination of redevelopment, infill, and contiguous new development, is a much better way to proceed and a much more cautious way to proceed, because you're really not making gigantic investments in sewer pipes and water lines.
Just wanted okay. Just to follow up, page 37 is a hot page, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's got numbers on it.
It's got numbers, right. On the projected number of housing for 2015 to 2025, it's 116, and that's at a 0.5% growth.
Yeah,
If it stayed
at
at the
0.5%.
current 0.4, that would knock that number down to 93. And if the growth isn't that high, one thing that's going to definitely happen in Salina is the population's going to age, which it is doing now.
That's right.
Now, is it your opinion that our current building community can adapt the type housing that we're going to need for a smaller, older group of people? You know, just to build units, no point in building a two-story ranch house for somebody
No.
80 years old.
Well, it's a very interesting time in that regard, because since we were here last talking to you, I found out that my younger daughter is pregnant with twin boys, which is very cool, but and somewhat unexpected. Yeah, we're not quite sure how that's going to work, but she's in Los Angeles and has her husband's parents there, so that's going to be there. But we've got two trends happening in the society right now. That is, at one end of the scale, we've got households that are getting smaller, and that are needing other kinds of housing. The younger seniors are tending to increasingly age in place, but also are looking in a lot of cases for independent, smaller units, some of which may only be seasonally occupied. You know, people who are more affluent will take off in the winter and then come back in the summer when their retirement homes in Arizona are uninhabitable. So they're actually occupying two, from a nationwide perspective, actually occupying 2 housing units. And then on the other hand, we're having our children who are now at the age where they're beginning to demand more family housing. So we've got these 2 different things that are happening, and builders who are really, you know, looking at demographics and a lot of builders are responding to that by understanding that there is a continuing need for and will be an increasing need over the next few years for family housing, and on the other hand, a need at the other end of the scale for something that's for a product that's a little bit different and does not involve quite so much individual time spent in mowing lawns and in maintenance of a home that might be empty for a few months a year. So it's a dynamic time that suggests that a lot of different types of housing are needed. There's also the issues of the millennials, not all of whom are old enough to be starting families yet, who are less inclined to be buying housing and more inclined to be interested in things like downtown lofts and townhouses and higher density settings that are around a downtown area that will probably fuel a lot of Salina's downtown growth as well. So it's a time that's interesting for a builder from that perspective. There's a lot of different product that's needed, and building kind of a monoculture of single-family detached owner-occupied housing is probably going to leave certain elements of the market out. Yeah, it's real. Will the builders of the city be able to adapt to that? That's a good question. And you know, whenever you're building something you're not used to, it entails a level of risk. And risk to achieve a desirable result and trying to allay that risk so that the private market works more effectively is really a significant component of public policy. So that's why doing things like at least at the front end, helping to reduce those risks so there are possibilities for demonstrations or building new products. They're not necessarily crazy things to do, but are things that people are kind of afraid to do because they're not used to it. That helping to cushion that risk a little bit is a way of getting things moving. So it's a time. It's so good. It's so good that we've been having this conversation with all of you over the last year, because I know it's starting to bear fruit in terms of thinking through those kinds of issues. And the best thing we can do as your consultants is to raise the issues and to show directions that you can go, but to get that kind of conversation and partnership going.
I guess one of the things I wanted to do was just to commend you for this study, because I've been around here long enough to know that there have been a lot of studies done, and I think some of them sat in City Hall and just went through the records and didn't really get out into the community. But I can tell from the study that you know Salina pretty well. And so if we have problems maybe in the future, you'll be able to help us out.
Glad to.
One of the things I noticed was that the respondents to the survey suggested that, or most of them voted that they didn't think we needed any like 4-bedroom housing. And it was probably 10 or 15 years ago, we were having a lot of people living together because of the economy. There were some minority communities that were living together, but So I don't know whether that was hit upon or if that's still happening, or I haven't heard of that so much as I did at one time. And the other thing is that I had written down as I was going through this, that we've had this moratorium on special assessments, as I understood it.
Yeah.
And what you were saying, that I think at the last session on that, was that we should use, or at least consider using special assessments as long as it's contiguous
Right. Yeah.
development.
Yeah, and as probably many of you know, on page 53, there's a specific table that suggests what to use in different kinds of contexts. So to kind of review how that all works, we divided the market up into different price points, and then into different policy objectives in terms of things that we would like to see accomplished. So there really are four kind of basic goals that we want to accomplish, and not any one project is going to accomplish all of those by any means. Number one is what we call price point. That is, we want to encourage the building of moderate cost workforce housing, and to focus some level of assistance to things that are going to deliver that product, so that people who are working in Salina can find decent housing options within the city. Number two, a thing that we want to encourage is what we again call contiguity. That is, encouraging developers or builders to build adjacent to the city rather than out somewhere beyond the city where we lose that tax base. A third thing that we want to encourage is density and innovation. That gets into the question about, will the builders of the city be able to respond to these emerging needs for new kinds of housing forms that maybe they're not used to. So we want to encourage that as well. And then the fourth deals with reinvestment. So that's where the infill redevelopment issue comes into play. And so we tried to put together a matrix that says, if these conditions are met, then here's the mix of special assessment versus private financing that we would suggest. That could be adjusted, but that framework, we think, provides a good way of proceeding. So again, for example, a subdivision with $300,000 or $400,000 houses don't need special assessments to help them get built, but that might provide some level of assistance. And by the way, in a minute I'll explain the assistance special assessments provide. That offering something like that will tend to keep that desirable type of development adjacent to the city, rather than going out somewhere where we lose the tax base. When we get into the more moderate price ranges, then special assessments are a good incentive to encourage the delivery of lots that serve units in that range. And then finally, when we get into reinvestment, which entails a higher level of risk, whether it's in a neighborhood where the surrounding property values don't really sustain that expense of a house, or land has to be acquired or something like that, then we're looking at deeper levels of subsidization, RHIDs or tax increment or tax abatements or other things that are in the toolbox. Now, here's an interesting question, and that gets into the special assessment question. Do special assessments really provide or deliver less expensive costs to the home buyer? The answer to that is really not. You pay one way or the other through special assessments. But what special assessments are is really kind of a risk abatement program. remember, in the document, we talk a lot about this issue of risk. And if I am a developer in a city like Salina, and I'm thinking about developing a 30-lot subdivision that might take 4 or 5 years to absorb, and I have to fund that entirely out of my pocket or privately financed, secured by and collateralized by my assets, and I don't really have a very good expectation of doing anything better than break even on those lots, I'm not really encouraged to take that risk. It's just I might not lose money, but I might, and I'm devoting a certain amount of my resources to collateralize that loan to build that infrastructure. If that's specially assessed, some element of the risk gets shifted over to the buyers of bonds who buy revenue bonds that are then paid off by special assessments on that property. So in effect, the public sector is taking on some of that risk that is really unacceptable to me as a small private businessman or businesswoman to take on. And if the projections are right and the development is a good one, the risk is not a huge one, but it's just a little bit of a help that makes it a little bit easier to deliver those lots. So the city's not trying to make a profit on the lots. The developer doesn't want to take a loss on them because they're holding them too long. So if the financing of that is shifted to the revenue bond device rather than private financing, it's easier for me to deliver those lots and to build on them. So it's a legitimate use of the powers of the city, but it should be used in places where it's going to produce an outcome that the city wants to see. So to use special assessments to build 2 miles of sewer out to some place that is going to be out in the country doesn't make any sense. If you want to do that, I guess it's all right, but it ought to be on your dime. But if you're willing to take that subdivision and build it in a way that's adjacent, where the costs are going to be less, then that's an incentive that we might want to provide, even though you might not need it economically.
So, Marty, I was going to ask, were there anything that we missed in this survey? You're looking pretty hard just at the city of Salina, but I was impressed that you wrote all the city streets around. You even got Commissioner Hardy's house picture in the study there. Did you ride the boundary roads in Salina, the Magnolias and Holmes and those kinds of streets?
Yeah.
If you're familiar with Holmes, if you go out to the south to Waterwell, there's a whole community of homes out there. If you go out Country Club, there's hundreds of homes. Are we missing anything to draw those people that are going out into the county, into the city? You talked about the contiguous development and maybe the idea of extra infrastructure. So if you fail to pave a road that's right against the city street, is that, I mean, you may be encouraging people to leave the city. Is that, are there any ideas like that?
If you're...
Well, if they might build in the contiguous part of the city rather than leapfrog and jump out to some other. So I'm wondering if there's any ideas like that we're missing when we discuss the in-the-city housing study that would help to encourage that housing that is going outside the city to stay here.
Oh, like changing subdivision standards and things like that.
I mean, to me, it gives some credence to finishing a road like Holmes, because you don't want people to continue to go that direction outside of the city limits. I mean, all of this, you got a great study, and I appreciate it. It's great advice, but it all kind of comes down to crystal ball and how much money you got in your pocket and how risk averse you are in all decisions.
Well, there are a couple of issues. One is that there's going to be a certain amount of the market that wants to live out in the country. It's just going to happen, and there are different strokes for different folks, as it were. There are people who really do want an acreage that's out in the country, and building acreages that are in the city is not an economical thing to do. I mean, just the cost of infrastructure make no sense. I'm not a huge advocate for relaxing subdivision standards, although I don't know that that's something that you were suggesting particularly. Although I think that it's good to be creative about development standards in certain areas. For example, I have seen beautiful urban subdivisions that use surface drainage rather than curb and gutter. That include sidewalks, but use really manicured drainage swales or surface conductors of stormwater. And we tend to focus on building pipes and curb and gutter, and there are green infrastructure solutions that we ought to be open to, and we should. I mean, it's hard to talk about a specific instance, but we should try to address issues on city edges that might tend to discourage contiguous development. So if it involves paving a road or something like that, that may be something that's worth looking at. But I think the things that ultimately encourage people with choices to build contiguous to the city rather than out in the country are, first of all, a sense of community and of being part of something, being part of the community and having those kinds of benefits. A desire for urban services, that is paved roads and sewers as opposed to unpaved roads and septics. That's a trade-off because you're trading off a smaller lot for those conveniences, and public services, namely police and fire protection. So I don't know if I'm answering the question very well.
No, you're doing fine there. I liked your answers about creativity and flexibility because I think you get a recommendation or some things in your codes that are too confining, and you don't allow the flexibility so that the public and private partnership can continue.
Yeah, I mean, there are, in terms of infrastructure solutions, there are a lot of interesting things that most cities ought to be looking at that are really not permitted by the codes, because a lot of the subdivision codes that we have around the country are all rooted in FHA guidelines from post-World War II. So they're based on a certain kind of street and a certain street section, and they don't always change very much. So looking at different ways of the streets really need to be as wide as they might be in new areas, because paving's expensive. Are there surface drainage or green infrastructure solutions that can reduce impact on stormwater and wastewater management, and that could cost less? Yeah, there are. I mean, it's important to be open to those kinds of approaches too.
Right. Well, and a couple other, just to follow up on that, but I've got questions about the page 53 as well. But one of the things, and you mentioned that we lose tax base out there, but another way to look at that too is that if somebody wants to build a $500,000 house out there, like you say, well, if you like gravel streets, if you like not to have fire and police protection, and if you like to have a septic system and everything else, the advantages are you have elbow room because you have the acreage and you have the space between your neighbors. But you don't have to pay city taxes. A lot of people live out there because that's what they want.
Right.
And some people just like to boil their water.
Right.
So
That's right. You can't. Yeah, you can't avoid that. I mean, there's certain. I mean, if people want to have horses, and there are people who do, they can't
and
have
we
a
aren't going
horse
to have
very well in the.
Right, we aren't going to have that, but there's also the crowd that says you know, a lot of those people, we're not having to pay for their infrastructure, their police and fire, or
Right.
spreading our services out thin either. So there are trade-offs on both of those.
Right.
As far as page 53 goes, and one of the things that, you know, I think it's important because affordability, and I've got questions that lead to that too, but part of this, because part of this study was to look at affordability, and then also what do we have as far as a mix, and what do we need as a mix, and
Right.
and all that. But I do know that the sparrow that flew in the window during all of this was special assessment, so we're addressing this. One of the things that I think we might have problems with when we run into price points and we try to say, we can provide this if you provide that, are we getting into a situation where we're being contractual with, you have to do this, and so if we do that, then you can't sell it for any higher than this, or we have to claw back portions of this. And now it's particularly timely, that question, because I think the state legislature is looking at legislation, or I think it was introduced last year, that would prohibit cities from providing tax cuts, and maybe Jason knows a little bit about that. He was actually, I can't remember what Senate bill that was, 366 or something like that. But anyway, there are things that could be coming down the road that if our policy is strictly based on being contiguous, then, and the price point, then sometimes we get a little bit, we might be into problems that we hadn't figured on. Having said that, I do like a sliding scale. I do like, even if you started out at you know, the 0 to 50, if it's once the more affordable it is, the more you get. I
Yeah.
like that if price points hold up.
Yeah.
If
You-
those kind of,
You've got to be, I mean, this is not going to be exact. I mean, right, I think if there, I mean, I assume Salina, for example, has subdivision agreements, or uses, when an area is platted, that there's a subdivision agreement that's adopted that identifies the responsibilities of the developer and of the city. And do you use that device, or?
Sorry, Marty, we were
Oh.
trying to talk about the bill and what
Yeah,
that was.
No,
but
no.
did you-
My question, Jason, is when you do a plat, do you have a subdivision agreement with the developer as well?
Generally, we don't specific to the plat.
All right. So a technique that we've used is that you have when a plat is approved, there's a subdivision agreement that sets up the various responsibilities of who's doing what. So, for example, the agreement may say that the developer will install the public improvements. Public improvements will be approved by the city, and X% of the public improvements are going to be financed by special assessments, and Y% by private financing. If there's open space, how it's maintained, so forth. So it basically is a structure that sets out the mutual responsibilities. Since we're talking about different kind of sliding scales, and the price point issue, and I thought about this too. The price point issue is a difficult one. And it's not going to be an exact one, and you're probably not going to put in something in an agreement that says that you shall not sell any house in the subdivision for more than $200,000, for example. That's kind of a, so you're doing it on kind of a market projection point of view. You know, you're saying you look at the developers when the project is approved or proposed. You roughly know the size of the house by the size of the lot. The developer will be building in a certain area and will have really be able to market. Will have a certain market target in mind. So it's kind of a question of negotiation and just sort of landing on what the right mix is. it sounds harder than it probably is. You know, when we're talking about giant houses, that's going to be clearly on the high end of the scale. When we're talking about more moderately sized lots that accommodate more moderately sized houses, that's going to be more in the $150,000, $200,000, $225,000 range. If we're talking about small lots and small houses, it's going to be more affordable. You know, I mean, people have you can kind of see where the market is in talking through the individual application, and that the agreement process then sort of focuses in on the mix of that. We have found the subdivision agreement, by the way, to be a very good tool in general to use in terms of defining who's responsible for what.
Okay, this is just a suggestion I have, because it looks like the discussion about special assessments was probably more heavily discussed on the development side versus, I know that there was very little input from the city commission side. I mean, we didn't have a stakeholder group and so on. One of the drivers that I've always had on the use of special assessments were being that they were an incentive tool, but also as they deal with smart growth and the ideas of smart growth. And that is I would only ask, would it be appropriate to have another column here? And one of the things that I've asked for is to say, does location matter? Which I think it probably does. I mean, I feel like it does. And if it does, should there be a fiscal impact analysis that goes along with whatever percentage of special assessment would be available as sort of a cost-benefit analysis? And then also, what happens if, like right now, we have an overabundance of what we would consider the above 250 in a number of subdivisions? Is there any provision saying, well, wait a second, you're oversupplied in that already, and in regard to that also, what is our supply on that in regard to where the study says is going to be our need in that category for the next 10 years? So those are all kind of related, but any ideas on that?
Yeah. We don't know what the existing inventory of high-end houses is right now versus need. You know, I think that we showed over the period a small need or a small likelihood for just 93 units over 20 years or over 10 years of higher end housing in Salina, which indicates that there's some, but it's not a whole lot. There's probably significant inventory, but we really didn't do that kind of a real estate analysis. So I can't answer that question very well. I would say that though that special assessments, you're absolutely right that we should tie the use of an incentive tool, and like special assessments, to desirable outcomes. So we were, in constructing this table, we're more concerned about two locational issues, one being reinvestment and the other being contiguity. So contiguity being, at least if you're going in south or east in areas that are experiencing most development, at least you're adjacent to those areas rather than going outside that, and thought about north side stuff as being much more reinvestment related, which carries with it deeper subsidization. So the whole thing is kind of constructed around that. If I were to sort of characterize it, if you're going out in the country, you're on your own. If you're building adjacent to the city in directions that are that are established by current trends, namely south and east, depending upon what price housing you're aiming toward, you can use special assessments. If you're going into an area that's counterflow, either infill or north, then that's reinvestment, and so we use special assessments plus RHIDs plus TIFs, which are basically RHIDs and so forth. So the higher, so in that gradient of incentives, the deepest incentives are in the areas that are most counter to normal market trends. Now you can change that somewhat, you know, or add another requirement. In Omaha, for example, we actually did require a fiscal analysis of subdivision, and still do, fiscal analysis of subdivision development, but that's because a lot of the development in our metropolitan area involves the use of a bonding device called sanitary and improvement districts that can issue geo debt to finance public improvements. So special assessments are sort of something that operates in the city, but in contiguous areas, these special districts are formed that have the power to issue basically municipal bonds. Well, that you definitely want a fiscal analysis of that, because if they don't work, then we'll never be able to annex those areas. And with special assessment development, not so much. Although because you are lending, you are underwriting to some degree, some level of feasibility analysis might be an appropriate thing to ask for.
On page 53, again, just so that I'm clear, when you refer to workforce housing, which, I'm assuming, one of these two lower categories, or maybe
really, workforce is really the two lower categories. You know, it's become, I guess, a bit of a euphemism now. You know, that when you're talking about housing, you keep finding new euphemisms too. So workforce housing generally means would generally mean in a Salina market below $175,000.
Because looking at I think it was the mean or median income, forget, which was listed for Salina a little lower than the state.
Yeah, a little lower.
I'm sure there are a lot of people below that mean and a lot of people
50% below, 50% of the households above.
right, and a lot of that 50% below are much lower.
Much lower.
So, and we have an aging population, as I'm finding out now as I'm getting older, means less ability to increase one's income. But
all of us are an aging population.
but is that income going to qualify for this moderate price range? I'm just looking at workforce housing in Salina. Is our workforce making enough money to buy a house?
Well,
In this range, yeah.
in that range, yeah. So here's yes and no. Our what's our, I can't remember what the number for the median
Income?
Yeah,
It's 41 something, I think.
45 or so.
45.
Yeah, in that range. So when we look at affordability, typically we say that 30% of adjusted gross income or less makes a unit affordable to that particular household. Now there are some markets where that number has gone out the window. You know, I mean, so in fact, there was just a story a couple of days ago that I was listening to on NPR that was talking about 50% as a more typical standard that's being used in some places, but that's far too expensive. So think about an adjusted gross income of $45,000. 30% of that is $14,000, right? 40, let's say 45, 30, well, yeah, $14,000. Which if you divide by 12 is about $1,200 a month that can be devoted to housing. At current interest rates, that median level is going to translate to something on the order of $150,000 house, something in that 140, 150,000. Part of that is because interest rates are very, very low right now and have been for a number of years. So the levels that we're talking about here, and keep in mind that we're talking in a range from 0 to 175,000, is probably it's probably a reasonable model to say that that's kind of the median value that's kind of the value that corresponds to the median income of Salina residents right now. Not to say that there aren't some who are working people who can't afford more than that or who can't afford that. It's a range, but the medians more or less match up pretty well.
Right, and as long as they have the down payment. And
Yes,
notice-
yes, exactly.
A lot of these examples, it looks as though some of the lower price housing is being made up of either renovation of distressed housing.
That's right.
Or housing that is left vacant by people who are moving up, as opposed to true new.
Correct. Exactly right. Yeah. In fact, that's probably you can't build a house for $60,000 anymore. But what you can do, and this is another very important initiative. You know, we've talked a lot about new construction and owner occupancy and so forth, but a very successful program, proven in many parts of the country and in many parts of the Midwest, is a nonprofit development corporation that when a somewhat distressed but rehabilitatable house comes on the market, it doesn't just go to a investor, which is kind of happening in Salina, but it gets purchased and then rehabbed and resold, and that's a way of delivering a acceptable unit in a price range below $100,000. You know, that's a very so you do things that are not just building new housing, which is the most expensive thing to do, but that can take advantage of some of these things you might look at and say, well, that's obsolete, or it's too old, or it's too small, and you put you have an organization that can put money into it, save that unit, and bring it back to life, and that is I think a big opportunity area for Salina.
Right, just to kind of build on that, one of the things, affordability, when I was looking at this, I thought, wow, you know, if you can afford a $180,000 to $200,000 house, then I think the 30% rule works quite well there. However, when you're looking at a lot of the areas of our community, is there any way to consider things like shelter poverty, area affordability, and physical, and some of the physical conditions, how those might in Salina, because we have a lot of lower incomes, how those might make that 30% more like a 20%, or, you know?
Oh, I
does that-
see. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if my income is X and I can afford 30%, that's what my rent is, but all of my other living expenses far out, I still don't have enough money at the end of the month. How do you account for that in what you're...
Generally in lower income areas, if you can achieve 30%, that's really good.
Right.
That all too often it's way higher than that, and that's in other words, people will be paying 50% of an income that can barely make ends meet. So yeah, no, I mean, I think that generally for rightly or wrongly, every program and every standard has settled on the 30% number as being a desirable goal.
Okay.
And now ironically, of course, usually the more income you have, the lower that percentage goes.
Right.
So if you're a high income, if you earn $1 million a year and you have a $500,000 house, you're paying way less than 30% of your income.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, but it's hard. It's really hard to get below that number. It just is. It's about, at least in our era, that's been kind of a good target to shoot at.
Any further questions? I've got one more, and it's 2:30, so we'll turn it over to staff and/or planning committee. Go ahead, Mike.
Marty, I just had one clarification. If I understood your description of the use of special assessments correctly, it seemed like it was a risk taken on by the market when they buy the special assessment bonds. But then later you talked about in situations where they're a general obligation debt of the community, sounded like a little bit different approach. I just want to be clear that in Kansas, special obligation bonds, or at least in Salina, are issued as a general obligation debt.
That special assessment bonds are GO debt.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So does
Then
that?
you do want to do a fiscal analysis.
Well, that was my question, whether that
Yeah.
changes your characterization at all.
That's I actually didn't know that because in Nebraska, for example, they're revenue bonds, so the city treats them like GOs, but they're actually legally not GOs. So the city will pay off the bonds and foreclose on the lots, but
Well, staff has done a unscientific risk analysis of the likelihood of, in a default, all we've got to recover is the value of the specials, not the market value of the lots. And so it seems plausible that we could secure them, turn around and sell them.
Yeah.
But that assumes there isn't a dearth of them in the community, and that could have impacts on the other developers that haven't defaulted that are trying to sell their lots at
Yeah.
market rate.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure if that changed your response to any of those questions.
yeah, no, I mean it just means that it's important to give a little bit greater scrutiny so if somebody comes in with a 300 lot subdivision and says I want it to be 100% specials, and our demand is maybe 100 units a year, optimistically, you might say, I don't know, build this thing in phases, and then maybe we'll talk. Or
Thanks, Mike. And I've got a whole lot of other questions. Let me just throw a few out, and then you can answer them, as hopefully planning commissioners will have some of those same questions. But they have to do with the housing mix, because I think there was some thought that if we needed 116 units, that somehow we were going to have to find 116 building lots. And so I'd like you to talk about how those mixes are, how those mixes are actually put out. Some things for beachheads, but if we have time at the end, maybe we'll ask some beachhead questions, because I think you had mentioned that a lot of the criteria is there for that as well. Couple of the things that I found intriguing from the affordability side were things like, and if you can maybe elaborate on things like how to establish and what a CDC does, maybe the role of CDFIs. When we're talking, I really like your idea that Amy shared last time about the acquire, rehab, and resell options. And then also, in some of your own other communities, you've discussed gateway housing and rent to own, and you did a little bit here, but a little bit more on that. And then just some of the difference between a land bank and a land trust, and what a land trust might be able to do on some of this affordability that, as far as design, development consortiums and maybe investment syndicates and stuff like that. But I'll let the planning commission go. But those are just some of the broad.
Okay. Do you want me to answer those now, or do you? All right.
Maybe
Okay.
elaborate on some of those, because you made a lot of those points.
Because I can, and maybe that. All right. So, all right. So.
Give so, yeah.
Yeah, all right, so a community development corporation is basically a nonprofit, I mean, a lot of things call themselves community development corporations, but when I think of a CDC, it is a nonprofit developer who operates like a private developer, but is funded by charitable contributions and is responsible for paying their own salaries, but doesn't make a profit. Whatever surplus it realizes goes back into the organization's capital fund. So they're basically, a difference between a developer and a CDC is that a CDC generally is involved in products or in areas that are not normally attractive to conventional private developers, and they're taking their operating surpluses that they hopefully make to support themselves and putting it back into the corporation rather than taking it out as profit. So what kind of project might a CDC do? Well, the idea of acquisition, rehab, resale is a very attractive one for a CDC. And in this case, the CDC is funded. It needs to have working capital at the front end. It uses that capital to buy houses, rehabilitate them, resells that house, and then takes the proceeds from that house and puts it back into the CDC so it can keep doing the same thing. There's some CDCs that have even had their own contracting crews. I mean, but in some cases, CDCs also can partner with private developers. So let's say a CDC wants to do a multifamily project and to do an innovative one like a rent-to-own project. It might contract with or form a joint venture with a private developer and proceed in partnership. So they may be a general partner and the private developer is a limited partner. That kind of raises the issue of the acquisition, rehab, resale program, which I just kind of described, where rather than if you were a private developer, you call it house flipping. It's buying a house, rehabbing it, and reselling it. Except the CDC may do it on a specific programmatic, geographic basis, and keeps doing it in a specific neighborhood. We in Omaha have had great success with that program, and throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin, those have been very favored programs as well. The idea of gateway housing is another thing to consider, and what happens in a project like that, typically rent to own, is that you build a rental development. Again, these are often done by CDCs. You build a rental development or rental units that may be detached or attached units, and may build those with low-income housing tax credits. The occupant of that unit is a low-income household, but a portion of their monthly payments, their rents, are escrowed into an account that builds up a down payment, which then allows them to accumulate the down payment that they need to then buy either that or another unit. By the way, if that unit is built under tax credits, they can't buy it for 15 years. But that's a different issue. It's an interesting program because it really sort of straddles owner and renter occupancy. So you can effectively act as if you were the owner of a unit, but not have to come up with the down payment, and it's a forced savings account. It's very interesting. Again, there's nothing new about it. If it's done on the private side, it's sort of more nefariously called a land contract, but CDCs presumably being more social type organizations, treated as equity accumulation. And it can be a very successful type of program. You asked about the difference or the application of land banks versus land trusts. I would have to say more of an advocate for land banks than I am for land trusts in a sense. The land bank is an organization or a device by which you can buy lots or structures that are in tax foreclosures, and literally bank those and accumulate enough of an inventory that you can eventually find a developer to take those over. So land banks are an acquisition type entity. So there are places that have land utilization authorities or land bank or land banking authorities that allow a public organization to accumulate property for eventual private development through tax foreclosures or purchases or so forth, and put that property aside till they've accumulated enough to make a development feasible. Land trusts are a little bit different deal. In a land trust situation, land trusts apply to areas that have rapidly appreciating housing and land values. And what happens with a land trust is that a land trust will acquire property, and a developer, whether it's the land trust or CDC, will build on it, but the land trust will hold title to the underlying property. So the premise being that the unit that's built on the site will remain affordable because its price won't be ballooning because the land value is increasing. So you see land trusts frequently used in places like Berkeley, as you know, places that where you're trying to keep housing prices affordable, but the land prices themselves are just go nuts. That's probably not, certainly in an area like North Salina, you would like to encourage homeowners to make a profit, that ultimately for their investment to be good. So I don't think land trusts are as applicable in stagnant or slowly appreciating markets. Land banks, however, are highly applicable. Did I leave something out, or is there?
No, I think you
Yeah.
did
Okay,
well. And
good.
what you did probably will come up in
Okay, good.
I've read where you can convert a shipping container for as little as $15,000.
Yes, you could.
And I could see whole developments of shipping containers at at cost less than the average rent, a low income rent. And what is the advisability and or your experience with tiny houses?
Well, micro housing is what it's now being called. Has become very trendy in places that have very expensive housing values. So you know, I mean, there are people in New York City who are now in tiny apartments. I mean, there always have been people in tiny apartments that because it may be that the only way of delivering a unit that's $150,000 to $200,000 is by limiting its size to 200 square feet. And they're very clever and ingenious things that are being done with it. So I think it's a coming thing. It is interesting that there were tons of houses that were built after World War II with FHA and VA mortgages for returning veterans that were typically 690 square feet. Little two-bedroom boxes. They're not pretty, but they functioned, and some are still in service. But then market preferences changed. You know, that people have demanded or wanted bigger and bigger things that just get to be more and more expensive because there's, of course, a relationship between square footage and unit cost. I think people are, there does seem to be some trend in the market toward higher quality and lower square footage. But I would probably defer to the builders in Salina to see whether that trend has really reached here. Yes, you can. There are interesting developments that are being done with shipping containers. I guess we'll have to see whether that takes hold or not. Most people wouldn't want to live next to one.
I was thinking about the whole development.
A whole development of shipping containers. Yeah, no, they're beginning to happen, and I think it's, there's also it's related to whether you see housing as a consumable, or housing as a long-term investment. A consumable, and mobile homes are really, it's really kind of a different. Mobile homes are viewed in some of the same way, that it's something that has a fixed life and then it goes away. We in America have viewed housing markets mostly as permanent, long-term investments, rightly or wrongly, and so that's caused us. That's meant that most innovative or unusual manufactured housing products have not really taken hold, even though they've received a lot of press. So the idea of the shipping container as housing is really not a new one, and people have experimented with modulars, not necessarily what we think is being modular housing, which are the double wide kind of situation, but sort of container type or mobile home type things put into mega structures. Since I was in architecture school and before, and they've always generated more magazine articles than they have actual results. So I would say right now it's interesting, and it's an interesting trend to watch, but it's just not happening on a mass scale.
I'd like to go back to the predictions of population. I think water was mentioned, and I think we'd all agree that that's really a big issue here. It seems to me that when we're noticing a climate that's hotter and drier, and a lot of projections are saying that will grow quite intensely in the next 20 or 30 years. But even immediately, we're seeing changes. It seems to me there are several things in regard to water. It could limit our population. One of the things we need is more jobs. If we allow new jobs that require a lot of water in the processes, that could be a real detriment to our ability to absorb more population. All of our water that comes from the Smoky Hill is coming from the west. We do not have water coming from the mountains. And if it's hotter and drier out there, even if it's okay here, we will not have as much of that water supply potentially. I mean, that's a possibility. We don't know, but it may be more than a possibility. It may be somewhat likely. And I guess I'm urging us to be somewhat flexible in the way we look at any projection we make, because we could be in a position really of losing population in the foreseeable future. I mean, some of us will still, not, I won't be here, but some of you will be, and I think that's a real concern for all of the cities out in this area. You and Omaha are somewhat on the other side of that line that's really worrisome. I'm told by those who have done a lot of research on this place that we stand right on the edge, right on the difference between north and south, east and west, and it's impossible to say how much we are going to bear the brunt of that. But certainly we will have less water from the west.
Yeah. Yeah, keep in mind, first of all, that the population projections are are a pretty modest increase. It's basically, I think we're projecting, we're at about a 3,000 population increase over 20 years. So it's not like we're suggesting huge increases, but it's small growth. But the issue of water is a fascinating one, and let me recount just a personal anecdote. In late October and early November, I did a bike ride for an environmental organization in Israel, and Israel was a country that 5 or 10 years ago was among the other factors that caused people to fight in the Middle East. Water was a critical issue, and certainly a critical issue for that country. And now, several years later, it's completely solved in an arid climate. And there's a book about it called "Let There Be Water," and I recommend the book to you. They solved their water problem from a supply point of view by desalination, which is obviously not an option in Kansas, but also by efficiency, and that is by using drip irrigation for agriculture. And so the consumption is very efficient, and I think we're going to have to look at that kind of stuff.
Conservation is the first place to go, of course.
Yeah.
And desalinization I have read about, and it's very highly energy draining.
Yeah.
Obviously. And one of the big problems is the environmental disaster of where do you put all that brine? You're left with salt.
Yeah.
So over the long term, we'll see about Israel. I am aware that they have a better situation now.
Yeah. That's those are very good points. And the better lesson from that is efficiency on the consumption end.
Are building codes taking water efficiency into account? You know, that's one of the first things we can do, and we're in that category in this discussion. I don't hear anything about that sort of thing being built into the home stock, the housing stock, or even industrial buildings. Is that commonly done?
It increasingly is, yes. In terms of like low flow toilets and other kinds of things. There's another. However, the biggest. I hate to say this in the Midwest, but the biggest change in terms of personal behavior that would affect water consumption is what we eat. But I mean there.
That's a whole other topic.
That's a different topic. It's way off our subject.
So Marty, I want to address this question in a way not just to you, but to some of the developers and the commissioners here, because this is where the rubber meets the road, and I'll try to be as succinct as I can. Just a quick statement of principle in teaching broadcasting, history of broadcasting. There was a lot of complaint about regulation in the early days of broadcasting until people realized that the spectrum was a public good and that without regulation, parts of that spectrum became unusable. It was merely a matter of who would blast over the other person. So I make that analogy in talking about how, and looking at the issues of regulation versus non-regulation, trying to support developers who are building that in the same spirit as what your original presentation was about, and I was very heartened by that and remain that way. But I recall, to come to the specifics, a couple of, both in meeting and outside of meeting, some of the developers and business persons in this room were talking about how if they could get, they themselves individually could not have the capital to address the kind of infill or other developments that were necessary. And you've talked, and we've talked here about CDCs, community development corporations, and as I believe we've covered this ground, that there's not one presently existing. But so I'm looking, for example, at the Centennial Park example of 10 homes being built. Looks like a very nice outline. It at least would give, as you say, a beachhead, and I appreciate that example. There may be others. So my question to everybody in the room, really, to you and commissioners and the others is, how can we go about putting into effect some kind of an organization, CDC or other, tap the available resources without, as you point out in the study, overly depending on federal and even state, because we find, I don't want to belabor this, but in the state we have shrinking resources. How can we make that happen?
Somebody want to?
Well, there's structure.
Somebody, probably everybody would like to hear somebody else's voice other than mine.
I think there is two things. One, we do have a CHOTO. It has not been active. It was put in place several years ago, and we've kept it in place because there is a lot of benefits to it. The other thing is that we've looked at, as the Salina Housing Authority, creating a subsidiary of that would be used as the CDC. It falls right in line with a lot of our goals anyway. And we could use that. We could use funding through sources such as the CHOTO, as also through the City Home Grant, those kind of things. And we already do a lot of that stuff with our public housing. We have 162 houses we redevelop, we modernize those units, and that we could do those kind of things. And it'd be great to have additional support through the city and those kinds.
I would say that a project like Centennial Park doesn't necessarily require a CDC. That probably works entirely on the private side without.
And yet there's not been a single private developer who said, this is a really good idea, let's do it. Not that I know.
Yeah, well, they have. It's a question. The biggest I wouldn't say obstacle, but the biggest issue there is availability of the land and settling on a specific project that works for both the neighborhood and the housing market. So that was and the idea of that diagram that's in the document is to show that you could take the tail end of that site that really isn't being used productively right now and really use it to reinforce the neighborhood, and then take the balance of and make a nicer neighborhood park out of it too. And in infill settings like that, it frequently is trying to find a win-win situation. That's why we're really insistent on that being an owner-occupied rather than a renter-occupied project.
Marty, this question is about housing needs. A lot of my projects right now with clients are conversions of upper-end existing houses to intergenerational houses. I have several going on right now. I've tried to convince builders of the need to actually build this floor plan, but I haven't been successful in Salina. Surely there is data and information that would convince people that there is a huge market for this, and we have an unusual wealth base here, which you have to acknowledge is different from other communities. We have very wealthy people who are coming out of agriculture-related businesses and huge investments in farm ground that can afford very expensive homes. And they are looking for very nice homes to transition to for end-of-life purpose, but they also need to incorporate their younger children who have been accustomed to living in $200,000+ houses also. So where are we going to find these homes that are in the $300,000 mark, can accommodate two families that have high incomes and have been accustomed to upper-end housing? And who's doing that now? Where can I go and see these?
They're doing intergenerational units. They're probably more likely to be on the coasts, frankly. Because I don't know that a whole lot of that particular kind of product is being produced in the Midwest, in my experience. It is much more. They're great. They're great ideas. Probably the closest thing that I have sort of more or less routinely see, and it's still pretty rare, are like two-family units where the older parents have a cottage or on as part of the development of the main unit. I also suspect that that's going to take some zoning revision, to some zoning flexibility to make that possible. But I'm curious. So you're doing conversions of big old houses.
Well, large ranch homes.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
But it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, and they're very difficult to find.
Yeah. Yeah, but they're not. I don't know of very many, at least in this part of the country, very much in the way of new stock that's doing that. But it's really. I mean, it's a really. I think it's a great concept.
So if you build it, they'll come, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean,
With.
I have a list of people waiting, so there must be people out there waiting.
I think when they're built for a particular buyer, and not speculatively. Yeah, or I mean, the idea of the two-family, what I refer to as two-family development, that is 2 units on 1 lot, certainly used to be more prevalent before World War II. You know, where you would have a carriage house or mother-in-law. Yeah, and it's happening again to the degree that it's getting inserted into zoning ordinances, but you still don't see a lot of it built. Not a good answer, but it's just it's a great idea that I think has legs, but you just don't see it much.
Hi, Marty. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I have a couple comments and then a couple questions also. One of them is, want everybody to remember when our developers and we use spatial assessments, they do put up a 35% irrevocable letter of credit also, which also
Yes.
helps insulate the city against any type of loss.
Yeah.
So that was one. The other thing is, I think sometimes we get confused about workforce housing and what I would consider new construction workforce housing. When we start talking about that $175,000 workforce home, that a lot of times is a home that somebody has lived in another home for 10 years, built equity. So when we're looking at debt-to-income ratios, as we were discussing earlier, you're not always looking at that new entry-level person moving into into a home. So we have to remember that they've done, they're able to afford that new home through previous ownership. One other thing, we did a study several years ago based on the number of homes that were necessary in the community, and I think we came up with between that 65 and 80. But whether we're looking at 50 or the 116, I guess your study would basically say do the same thing. Is that correct? Did I understand that?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
we shouldn't get so hung up on where Marty is off on 116 or whether we were low on the 85. You're saying continue with the...
Keep in mind that 116 is
units.
assuming a growth rate that you haven't achieved.
Right. Ours was based on a past 10-year history.
Yeah,
when we
and
did ours. So.
I would. Yeah, so it's saying by positioning the community with job growth and investments in quality and so forth, there is an opportunity to increase that. Not that need exactly exists today. So in a way, it's saying if it's an if-then statement that if Salina were able to achieve 0.5% growth a year, then it would need 110 to 120 units to be able to accommodate that. So if that level of population growth, which I think is not unattainable, I mean this is a city that's got, number one, a lot of resources now, and number two, is making some significant investments that will increase its marketability. That's not an unattainable thing, but it isn't there right now.
One other thing, when we were discussing spatials and we were looking at the dollar amounts, and you asked about the plat, we really control what happens in those subdivisions through covenants and restrictions. And so a lot of times we don't discuss the value, we discuss whether it's 2-3 car garage, is, square footage and that type of thing. So if there's some, tweaking needs to be done, maybe you do it through the, looking at the different covenants and restrictions that we use on our communities,
Right.
Marty. And my final thing is, and I guess I'll direct this towards the commissioners, is we've been looking at a little bit, talking to the city, talking to North Salina Group, talking to the developers, and one of the things we've said is we are interested in doing redevelopment and infill. Again, we have a lack of knowledge, and tell us, and we discussed this, I asked this question last time about who leads that charge. And I think if the city is serious about doing some of this, we need to look at a paid staff person, because I see this as a very difficult thing to do through a group of volunteers. I know we are at a disadvantage right now. We're not an entitlement community. If we would hit that 50,000 population, that would have been like a $350,000 a year shot in the arm that could have gone for, I believe, infrastructure, purchasing ground. So that hurts us a little bit. I think we can do some things as far as rehabilitation through some other groups, but when you get into the redevelopment and the infill, we don't have the expertise, nor do we know where to go out and get some of that funding. And that's just
Right.
something I would throw out to the city commissioners.
That's a great point, because a viable CDC doesn't happen by volunteers. It just can't. So the right partnership is an organization with staff that works with the building community to get stuff done. Now that could be within the housing authority or within the rubric of the existing CHOTO, but it's got to have, it gets to be a big enough enterprise that it's got to have somebody who's running it, researching it, putting the projects together, and basically developing and marketing the projects. So again, a project like Centennial Park, that idea could probably be done privately. A lot of the things that are much more complicated that involve major neighborhood transformation really are going to require a different level of hands-on attention. And I mean, I have seen, and I've seen CDCs that are attempting to operate without staff and with volunteers, and however well-intentioned they are, they don't work. You can't, you just can't. People have their own lives to live.
Marty, I'm just going to make a comment. I'm a little amazed at some of the comments on this session that are pessimistic. I think Salina has a great future. I think the city's doing some great things to make things happen, and I think maybe we should be talking a little more upbeat than pessimistic. That'd be it.
I agree, totally. People don't in a city don't always realize what they've got, and Salina's got a lot. I mean, it is and I've used it in other parts of the country as an example of a place that really has, in many ways, had its act together from a civic investment point of view. So you look at resources like the art theater downtown, or the riverfront, or the zoo, and the entire Greenway complex. It's pretty cool place. The downtown itself, and now you're making kind of another cycle of reinvestments in it. It's a place that does have a story to tell, and I think there's real cause for optimism.
I have a couple of questions or well, an opinion that I need either verification. I guess that's a question. If you have an opinion and you want to ask if it's correct or not. Triggered on page 48 in the report where the City Council established a temporary moratorium on the use of special assessments, but has seen no increase in infill housing. And it's my opinion that we've also seen no negative effect on the rate of new construction during that time. So I guess my first question is, am I correct about that? And my second question is, how many vacant lots are already out there, whether they have special assessments or not? So how big is the inventory of conventional lots? So how much time do we have before we adopt some new policies about, as you've suggested in your report?
Yeah, I don't know that I've got the answer to that, to those questions. My understanding is that the planning that has been happening has been stuff that's in the pipeline, but maybe somebody can answer that better than I.
Well, I'll take a first stab at it. Staff worked on an inventory of vacant lots well in advance of the special assessment moratorium or the housing study, and I was integrally involved with that. And what we did is we just took the county data and said, let's identify any platted parcel that has a structure value of less than a couple $1,000s. So that is all the infill vacant lots. That is just a shotgun blast across the community. We did narrow it down to residential zoning, but it was over 400. But when you back out, the active platted residential subdivisions, that number's dwindling pretty quickly. So when you say when I say there's 400, it's more so that random lot sprinkled in an existing neighborhood.
So how many are in the active platted, relatively new plats? Is that 60, 80? Is it 160? Is it 2 years worth,
right.
or 3 years worth, or one?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it was less than 100. It was, and what we've seen, and this is a little speculative. Gary could back me up on this or not. I think some of the lots near the levee that weren't being purchased or weren't being developed on when the special assessment moratorium went into effect, they got purchased, and we saw more interest in developing those. So I think the more typical developable lot inventory is shrinking.
Okay, so but the moratorium may have helped speed up sales of the existing recently platted lots. Is almost what you said there just a second ago.
I think the moratorium could have caused interest in platted developable lots along the levee that had sat idle for quite some time.
Okay, so at any rate, the pressure's on the city to do something within a year or less.
Based on my experience, the city right now has a glut of higher-end platted lots. They don't get built on very rapidly. But the need we have now, and it's a pretty dire need, is in that range from 150 to 250. We are virtually out of platted lots with infrastructure. And I guess Kelly could probably reiterate that we're out. There are a few.
Go back to the scattered old ones, but then they won't support the appraisals.
No, right, exactly.
And Marty can get into that and
self-finance.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Remember, if we run out of those lots, you run out of that stair step, so you don't have individuals who are able to buy that 80 to move up the 150 and so on and so forth. So it could stagnate our market considerably. Plus, if we're forming a new EDO group, and if they're successful and you have companies come in here, you have got to have lots available to build homes. Even if you don't have homes built, you have to have lots available to build homes to hit that niche. And if you do not have that, why are we spending money on EDO? I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that feed off of each other. So you have to think through the whole process and everything. My opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the interesting case of that was that I've been involved in over the years is Dodge City. That we did a couple of housing studies in Dodge City, and the first one we did was, wow, this is 16, probably 10 years ago. Dodge City had gotten to the point where you could almost count available lots on both hands because there was no device to get infrastructure funded, and so we said there's an emergency situation here and there's got to be a mechanism established for dealing with that, and here's some parameters of it. And the RHID idea then kind of grew out of that, and they really took advantage of that device. But that's right. I mean, if you don't even, you've got to have, to be able to respond to any kind of opportunity, there's got to be at least some advanced supply too, and that's important. The question I don't know about is what impact has the moratorium had on new platting? I don't know the answer. What actual effect has it had?
I'll defer that one to the zoning administrator.
Well, what we have found is over the years it's a feast or famine situation when it comes to platting, and so instead of doing an even amount of platting each year, the market kind of has a spike in platting. Those lots are built on and the inventory is reduced, and then the market recognizes a shortage of lots and they identify areas for new plats. So right now the planning staff has 5 subdivision areas that are under review, and there are 282 lots proposed within that. That's our active platting review right now, and that's a spike that we haven't had since around 2008. And so you can count on a couple fingers the number of plats we had between 2008 and this year, and the market seems to be identifying that we have a need for additional platted lots. So there are 5 different active subdivisions, and there's 282 lots in that review.
Do you want to respond, Marty, before?
Oh, is that assuming the use of specials or the non-use of specials?
We don't know the answer to that
Don't know the
because
answer to that,
the plats have been at the Planning Commission level, and 3 of them will be moving forward to the City Commission for acceptance of dedications here at the end of March. And if those are all accepted, then the next step will be for the developers to make requests for how the infrastructure is going to be financed. So some of that will be a function of whether the developers of those particular subdivisions make a request for special assessment financing.
Uh-huh. So you might approve a plat. You would then approve a plat without exactly knowing how the improvements are financed. I see.
That is correct.
I see.
It's not ideal, but we get the plat configuration, everything finalized, and then oftentimes the infrastructure and the plats are put in phases, and so when that phase comes forward, then that's when the developer will make a request to the governing body for special assessment financing, depending on how they want to phase in the infrastructure.
I see. So the answer is it doesn't affect platting, but it might affect execution. Would probably be the right answer there. Yeah.
So I think Mr. Byquist and Mr. Hoppeck's comments are well taken,
Yeah.
and I appreciate their giving them. One thing that I have wondered about, and this is pure speculation because I don't know, I believe no staff has been appointed to the EDO that Mr. Hoppeck mentioned. And if the EDO has as one of its goals in economic development the availability of housing and how that housing is shaped, I wonder whether there might not be dollars allocated, recognizing that the allocation of public dollars is a minefield. To the consideration of bringing people together, public and private, around creating that kind of development, that kind of housing. And again, I'm coming back to that Centennial Park idea of housing that otherwise might not be interesting, except that it's in this nice area as created. So, one brief comment. Several citizens undertook some 6-8 years ago a complementary currency project, which we saw as a way of levying without dollars involved in the way we define them, typically a new way of approaching getting people who would contribute energy and ideas to community benefit projects. It's very difficult to do that because no one agency would or could allocate use of equipment or part of their staff. And it seems like it's a very similar issue to what we're talking about here. Somewhere we need to have, and I think the point's well taken, you need to have, and your point, volunteer staff isn't going to cut it. We need to have paid staff to do it. So it would appear to me there's a common mission here, and so I'd just like to throw that out as a possibility. And even the North Salina group has ideas that can contribute a lot of volunteer time with them too.
Good point.
I'm not, I may try to answer this one if Mike wants to agree or disagree, that's fine. Jason Gage has had to step out of the room, but from what I know of the EDO process and kind of the staffing as well as the budgeting, the budget is limited, the staff will be limited, and while this does directly relate, I don't think they're going to have the time and the energy to concentrate on housing to the level that we're talking about and accomplish, to get themselves stood up as an economic development organization and accomplish the broader economic mission.
And I wonder if it's not possible to have this as a springboard, that some portion of that time could be allocated and perhaps that could be spoken about.
And I think that's a possibility. I was sitting next to Jason at the last meeting we had when I asked him to do it and EDO came up and he goes, that's not happening. And exactly for what Mike said, Mr. Sprague said, is they're going to worry about getting smokestacks and wanting to do it one way instead of housing. So they have their plate full. So that is something 10 years down the road, maybe someday we'll look at. I think that's their hand.
Yeah, they're very much complementary functions, though.
Anybody else? If not, I would like to have a round of applause for Marty. He's been here multiple times. He and Amy are quite knowledgeable about our community, sometimes I think more than what staff is in different areas. They've ridden multiple streets in the community. They've been out talking to people. Our public meetings and our focus groups, I think, have been very beneficial to us. One of the things that Marty talked about in the beginning was the fact that we could take portions of this plan and start to make some action plans for ourselves within the community and adopt some of those action plans or policies within our city government and start working on some of the projects that have been noted here today. Just remember that some of the projects in the beachheads that Marty has talked about in the plan, some of those have already changed since the plan was started. So the beachheads are an indicator that there are multiple places in our community that a new beachhead could be developed and started and actually spur on some development within that specific region. So if you have a beachhead and you're ready to start doing something, the EDO is really ready to talk to you, and the staff is ready to start talking about some of the projects. Is there anything else, Mike, that you can think of? We appreciate everybody coming out today.
Thank you very much.
Especially the focus group people and the people who worked on our special meetings and after hours that came out and gave their time and their information to Marty. Those who completed the surveys have been very helpful for us, and we've got a lot of very good input. I think we can now put a conclusion to the plan and take some policy statements back to the City Commission to start working on in our future housing. So thank you very much.